There's a number that should genuinely scare you, $1.4 trillion. That's how much developing countries paid only in interest on foreign debt in 2023. Not the original loans, not reducing what they owe. Just interest, $1.4 trillion taken from the poorest nations on Earth and transferred directly to creditors in Washington, London, and Paris. That single year of interest payments is larger than the entire GDP of Spain, larger than Australia's GDP, and here's what makes it truly devastating. For every $1 of aid that enters the developing world, $14 flow out through underpriced exports, overpriced imports, and profits sent back home by foreign corporations. Read that again, $1 in, $14 out. That isn't aid, that's extraction, that isn't development assistance, that's a systematic transfer of wealth on a scale humanity has never seen before. Over the past 6 decades, this system has drained $62 trillion from poor and developing nations into the banks and corporations of the developed world. $62 trillion, more than the combined GDP of the United States and China, nearly twice the total global debt. And it wasn't stolen illegally, it was extracted legally through a mechanism most people have never heard of, yet it controls the economic fate of 152 countries. That mechanism is the International Monetary Fund. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how the IMF debt trap works, why it is the most effective tool of economic colonization ever created, how it has crippled entire regions of the world, and, most alarming of all, why the United States is now heading straight into the same trap that has enslaved developing nations for the last 60 years. Because this is no longer just about Africa, Latin America, or Asia. This is about the coming end of American economic sovereignty. And the timeline is 5 to 10 years. Let's start with the scale of what's happening right now, because most people have no idea how extreme this has become. The developing world currently carries $31 trillion in total debt. At first glance, that doesn't sound shocking. The United States alone owes more than $38 trillion. But here's the critical difference. The U.S. borrows in its own currency, a currency it can print. It controls its central bank. It controls its monetary policy. It can inflate away its debt. Developing countries don't have that option. They borrow in dollars, euros, and yen, currencies they do not control. And when they can't pay, they don't get bailouts. They lose everything. Today, nearly 60% of low-income countries are officially classified as being in debt distress. That means they are either on the edge of default or have already defaulted. 60%, that's not a handful of failed states. That's the majority of the poorest countries on Earth, trapped in debt they can never repay. And here's where the math becomes completely insane. Many of these governments now spend more money paying interest to foreign creditors than they spend on healthcare, education, and infrastructure combined. Let me give you a real-world example so you can see how this works. Zambia. Between 2018 and 2021, just 3 years, Zambia's debt repayments jumped from 20% of the national budget to 38%. During that same period, healthcare spending fell from 9.5% to 8%. Education spending collapsed from 17% in 2016 to just 12% by 2022. Think about what that actually means. In 2022, Zambia spent 38% of its entire national budget paying interest to foreign banks, while only 12% went toward educating its children. The country is literally sacrificing its future to pay its creditors, and Zambia is not an exception. This is the standard pattern across dozens of countries trapped inside IMF programs. Cut education, cut healthcare, cut infrastructure, pay the debt, always pay the debt. And if a country refuses, the IMF cuts off access to international credit markets. The currency collapses, imports become unaffordable, inflation explodes, the economy implodes. So governments comply because they have no real choice. This isn't development policy, this is economic slavery run on spreadsheets. Now let me show you who actually controls this system, because once you understand the power structure, everything becomes clear. The IMF has 190 member countries, almost every nation on Earth. But voting power is not distributed equally, not even remotely. The United States alone holds effective veto power over all major IMF decisions. One country out of 190 can block anything. And overall, the global North, the wealthy industrialized nations, holds 9 times more voting power than the global South combined. 9 times. So while the IMF presents itself as a neutral global institution, helping countries in crisis, in reality it functions like a boardroom controlled by the richest economies on Earth, making decisions that benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else. And here's proof the system is rigged. For 65 years, every single managing director of the IMF has come from Western Europe, not Africa, not Asia, not Latin America, Europe every time. For more than 6 decades, the institution that controls the economic fate of 152 developing nations has never once been led by someone from the developing world. That's not coincidence, that's design. Now let me show you how the debt trap actually works, because once you understand the mechanism, you'll see why escape is almost impossible. The pattern follows 5 stages, and it has been repeated in more than 100 countries with almost identical results. Stage 1, the crisis hook. You can't trap a stable, healthy nation with debt. They don't need to borrow. So you wait for a crisis, war, natural disaster, economic collapse, political instability, a commodity price crash. When a country is desperate and on the edge of collapse, that's when the loan appears. The IMF doesn't create the crisis, they just wait for it. And when it comes, they present themselves as the only possible salvation. The country is drowning, the IMF throws a rope, there's a noose tied at the end. Stage 2, the conditional loan. The IMF offers emergency funding to stabilize the crisis. But the money comes with conditions, lots of them. They call it conditionality. It sounds technical, it sounds reasonable. In reality, it's a takeover manual. To receive the loan, the country must agree to cut government spending, especially on social programs, raise taxes to guarantee debt repayment, remove subsidies on food, fuel, and essential goods, privatize state-owned industries and sell them to foreign corporations, open markets to foreign imports while removing protections for local industries, devalue the currency to make exports cheaper for foreign buyers, restructure the tax system to prioritize debt repayment over public services. These aren't recommendations, they're requirements. If the country refuses even one condition, the loan is denied. And without the loan, the economy collapses immediately. So governments sign not because they agree, but because they have no alternative. Stage 3, the austerity spiral. Once IMF conditions are accepted and the loan is released, the real damage begins. Government spending is slashed, public sector workers are fired, food and fuel subsidies are removed, sending prices soaring, schools and hospitals lose funding, infrastructure projects are canceled, state-owned enterprises, often the most profitable parts of the economy, are sold off to foreign corporations at fire sale prices, and the economy doesn't recover, it gets worse. Independent evaluations show that countries under IMF programs grow, on average, 1.5 percentage points below the IMF's own projections in the first year. Let me say that again, the IMF's own programs cause economies to shrink more than even the IMF predicted. That's not a rescue, that's sabotage. And as the economy contracts, tax revenues fall, unemployment rises, poverty spreads, the government now has less money, more social unrest, and still can't meet its debt obligations. So what happens next? They go back to the IMF for another loan. Stage 4, the dependency trap. This is where the trap snaps shut. The country becomes addicted to IMF loans. New loans are taken just to pay interest on old ones. It's a Ponzi scheme at the national level. Each new loan comes with even more conditions, more privatization, more budget cuts, more foreign control. IMF loans are released in tranches, meaning the money arrives in installments. To receive the next installment, the country must hit specific targets set by the IMF. Miss a target, and the payment is frozen. And when an IMF payment is frozen, global investors panic, the currency collapses, imports spike in price, the economy implodes. So governments comply with whatever the IMF demands, not because it works, but because stopping means instant collapse. At this point, the country loses control of its own economic policy. The IMF decides how much it can spend, what it can tax, which industries must be privatized, which laws must be rewritten. The government still exists, but only on paper. In reality, it becomes a puppet. The IMF pulls the strings, and the country enters what economists call perpetual debt distress, a state where the debt can never be repaid and IMF oversight never ends. It's a sovereign nation in theory, a debt colony in practice. Stage 5, permanent extraction. Once a country is locked into the dependency trap, the extraction begins, and it never stops. Nowhere is this more visible or more devastating than in Africa. Every single year, $88.6 billion leaves the African continent through capital flight. That's nearly 4% of Africa's entire GDP. Gone. Not invested in roads, not spent on schools, not used for hospitals or industry. extracted and transferred to banks in London, New York, and Paris. That $88.6 billion every year could rebuild infrastructure, fund education, and develop local industries. Instead, it flows out as debt repayments, repatriated corporate profits, and illicit financial transfers. And this isn't new. Over the past 60 years, more than $62 trillion has been drained from the developing world into wealthy nations. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire global economy produces in a single year. That's generational wealth, gone forever. The results have been catastrophic. Between 1979 and 1992, Africa's total GDP growth was less than 1% over 13 years. Not per year, total. 13 years of IMF reforms, and the continent's economy was essentially frozen. Investment collapsed, factories shut down. Africa's share of global exports fell by more than half. In 1970, Africa supplied over 20% of the developing world's agricultural exports. By 1990, that number had collapsed to just 8%. Manufacturing was hit even harder, falling from nearly 8% of developing world exports to just over 1%. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means. Africa was deindustrialized, the continent didn't stagnate, it went backwards, and this happened under IMF supervision. The very programs that promised growth destroyed entire industries instead. And here's the most brutal irony of all. Today, in raw numbers, there are twice as many Africans living in extreme poverty as there were in 1980. 40 years of IMF programs, billions in loans, endless reforms, and poverty doubled. That isn't failure, that's design, because the IMF was never built to develop Africa. It was built to keep Africa as a source of cheap raw materials and a captive market for Western goods. Now let me show you how this works in practice, because the pattern is identical across continents. Take Zambia. In the early 2000s, under IMF pressure, Zambia privatized its copper mines, the lifeblood of the national economy. The promise was efficiency and foreign investment. The reality was unemployment, lost public revenue, and foreign corporations extracting the wealth. The mines were sold for a fraction of their real value to multinational corporations, companies that received tax exemptions, profit guarantees, and sweetheart deals. Zambia, once the world's third largest copper producer, ended up earning less from copper exports than Chile, despite having similar production levels. Why? Because the profits didn't stay in Zambia. Foreign corporations extracted the copper, paid minimal taxes, and sent the profits back to shareholders in London and Toronto. Zambia was left with the hole in the ground. The West walked away with the wealth. Now look at Russia. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Western economists and the IMF pushed a policy known as shock therapy. The idea was simple and brutal. Transition from communism to capitalism overnight. Privatize everything, remove price controls immediately, open domestic markets to foreign competition all at once. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin implemented the plan. The result was the worst economic collapse in modern peacetime history. Prices exploded by 2,500% in a single year, while wages remained frozen. Life savings were wiped out overnight. Poverty jumped from virtually zero under the Soviet system to over 40% of the population. Life expectancy dropped by 6 years, entire industries collapsed, unemployment surged, and while the economy burned, a small group of men, many with direct ties to Western banks, bought up state assets for pennies on the dollar. Oil companies, gas monopolies, steel plants, banks, all sold at absurd discounts. That's how Russian oligarchs were created. Not through innovation, not through entrepreneurship, but through IMF-backed privatization schemes that transferred Soviet state wealth into private hands, the largest robbery in human history. And the pattern didn't stop there. Argentina followed the same script in the 1990s. Under IMF guidance, it privatized major industries and opened its economy. For a few years, money poured in. Then in 2001, everything collapsed. Banks froze deposits. The currency crashed. Unemployment surged to 25%. Millions were thrown into poverty, all under IMF supervision. Now here's why this matters to you right now, especially if you're an American in 2026. Because the same debt trap mechanism that destroyed the developing world is now being applied to the United States. And most Americans have no idea it's happening. The U.S. national debt stands at $38 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio is 128%. We are just 2 percentage points away from the 130% threshold, the level at which every major empire in history has entered systemic crisis. The U.S. is now paying $1.2 trillion per year in interest alone, more than 20% of total federal revenue. And that number is rising rapidly as old debt is refinanced at higher interest rates. Right now, the United States is in stage 3 of the debt trap, the austerity spiral. We're not under IMF control yet, but we're following the exact same mathematical pattern, borrowing new money to pay interest on old debt, running $2+ trillion annual deficits with no credible plan to reverse them, watching interest costs consume the budget while infrastructure decays and social programs are quietly cut. And here's the terrifying question no one wants to ask. What happens when the United States can't pay? What happens when we reach stage 4 and need a bailout? Who bails out the country that prints the world's reserve currency? The answer is simple: nobody. The dollar collapses, reserve currency status is lost, and the United States enters a debt restructuring with international creditors. That restructuring will look very familiar because it will mirror exactly what the IMF has imposed on developing nations for decades. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, the European Union. They will demand concessions, control over strategic ports and infrastructure, ownership stakes in critical industries, long-term leases on land and national assets, direct access to U.S. tax revenues to guarantee repayment, and some form of international debt administration. Something similar already existed before. In 1881, the Ottoman Empire lost control of its finances when foreign creditors created an international debt commission that directly collected Ottoman taxes and forwarded them to creditors. This isn't fantasy. It isn't absurd. It's exactly what has happened to every country that crossed the debt threshold and couldn't pay. Economic sovereignty ends, political sovereignty becomes symbolic. You still fly your own flag, but you operate as a debt colony. Now, let's talk about the timeline based on current trajectories. 2024 to 2027, stage 3, intensifies. Annual deficits remain above $2 trillion. Interest costs climb from $1.5 trillion toward $2 trillion per year. Political paralysis prevents any serious reform. 2027 to 2030, stage 4, begins. A failed treasury auction or a major geopolitical shock triggers a loss of confidence. Foreign creditors demand higher yields or stop buying U.S. debt altogether. The Federal Reserve is forced to monetize debt at massive scale. Dollar credibility fractures. 2030 to 2035. Stage 5, debt restructuring. Some form of international debt conference emerges. The global monetary system is reorganized, and the United States is forced to accept foreign oversight of fiscal policy in exchange for continued access to credit. This is the same 5-stage pattern that has destroyed 152 developing nations, and right now, the United States is in stage 3. So what do you actually do? How do you protect yourself when your own country is walking into a debt trap? First, understand the core rule the IMF model teaches. Wealth always flows from debtors to creditors. If you're a debtor, you're controlled. If you're a creditor, you profit. Eliminate personal debt aggressively. The debt trap works on individuals the same way it works on nations. Second, position yourself in hard assets that retain value regardless of currency stability. Gold, silver, Bitcoin, productive real estate, anything that isn't just a promise from someone else to pay. Third, build skills that produce real, tangible value. History shows that when systems collapse, only people with practical skills survive. Medical, agricultural, mechanical, construction, anything that can't be easily offshored or automated. Fourth, maintain international optionality. Don't keep 100% of your assets, income, or exposure in a single jurisdiction. Diversify across countries and currencies. Fifth, watch the warning indicators. U.S. debt to GDP crossing 140%, danger zone. A failed treasury auction, crisis ignition, international fiscal oversight, sovereignty ending. Let me close with the core truth. The IMF is not a rescue organization. It is a debt enforcement mechanism, a tool of financial colonization that has transferred $62 trillion from the poorest nations on Earth to the richest over 6 decades. It promises stability, it delivers submission, it offers loans, it demands sovereignty, and the pattern has never failed. 152 countries, one blueprint, one outcome: debt, dependence, extraction. Now that same mechanism is being prepared for the United States. Because the math doesn't care about military power, it doesn't care about nuclear weapons, it doesn't care about historical exceptionalism. When you owe more than you can repay, you lose control. The creditors take over. The United States is $38 trillion in debt with no plan to stop borrowing. The trap is closing. Most Americans don't see it yet, but the developing world knows exactly what's coming. Because they've already lived through it, the only question is whether you recognize the pattern before it's too late. If this exposed a system you didn't even know existed, subscribe now and turn on notifications. The next video breaks down China's debt trap strategy through the Belt and Road Initiative and why it's the same IMF playbook executed faster with 21st century tools. You need to see it. The debt trap isn't theory, it's a proven weapon. It has conquered 152 nations in 60 years. And now it's coming for America. The pattern is clear, the timeline is 5 to 10 years. The only question is whether you prepare before the trap closes.